All right, friends, so this is going to be a video that introduces imperialism. I want to really come about it together in class. I want us to go over it, talk about what it means, these spheres of influence, conceptualize it. And everyone has been doing this for a long time. They're having a whole lot of fun out there with mock trial, by the way. So if you hear that, don't be alarmed. They're just having fun. Legal stuff is so much fun. But I want us to get into that in class, so you're not going to see the beginning part of this outline in this video. I'm actually going to start with China. So remember, the United States comes late to the imperialist game. We're going to talk about that in class. Then we're going to talk about Hawaii as the place where we really sharpen our teeth on this, where we start to get involved in this imperialist game ourselves. So I'm going to pick up these other examples, such as China and Japan, and talk about that quickly, and then set up a little bit of the Spanish-American War. So when you and I come into class, we are getting to understand imperialism from a basic level, and then we're going into the Spanish-American War with it already set up, okay? So if you go to that part where it says China, China, like Japan, had kept to itself for a really long time. And what they had done was really cut things off, strictly kept out foreigners, everything else, and they had only allowed trade through one specific area. Now, Britain in 1842 forces them to stop this. Britain is going to force them to open up their ports, and when they do, we, of course, are going to want in down the road. Now, Britain forces them to open this up, and we're going to talk about how Japan, which was also a country that kept everything out, no foreign trade, well, guess what? We are going to change that and be involved in how they are going to become much more imperialist. They take Taiwan. They are going to take the Liaotung Peninsula. They keep going. And they're taking chunks of China. And what we're going to see, too, is all these other countries also taking chunks of China. Great Britain, Germany, Russia, France, they're all going to create what we call these spheres of influence in China. And again, not technically colonies, right? This is imperialism, and we're going to talk about what that means. You are basically riffing on mercantilism in a way, but you're giving much less support, and you're just taking those raw materials and kind of using these countries. And we're going to talk about, unfortunately, how that is all the rage at this time and how these countries that are being taken advantage of suffer for it. So what happens is we hear that everybody's carving up China, and there's a political cartoon we're going to look at where people are actually looking at China like a piece of pie, and Russia, France, everybody has a say, and China's going, what the heck? Why don't I have a say about you carving up my country? And we want in. It seems like we're a little too late. Now, think about this, right? If you were in a situation where you're not invited to a party, you missed the invite, you didn't get it, and you were never invited, and then you see it on social media, decency would just say that, like, you don't try to invite yourself, right? You missed out, or like you were never invited in the first place, whatever it was. You don't go and ask, hey, I think I'm invited. No, that's embarrassing, right? I mean, none of it's ideal, but that's embarrassing. You shouldn't act that way. So John Hay is our Secretary of State, and John Hay is going to say, hey, see what I did there? I would like us to get a sphere of influence in China. And we weren't invited. We were not invited. But we devised this open door policy. And we say, hey, everybody, we think that you should have us and everybody come to China. And they're like, this is so embarrassing because we're already here. Like, do they know? Do they know they weren't invited? Do they know that that's not a part of the game? So we send this letter regardless to Great Britain, to Germany, to Russia, to Japan, to France, and to Italy. And no one responds. So we literally write ourselves an invitation called the open door policy to set up a sphere of influence in China. No one responds because they're like, oh, so embarrassing for you. At least that's how I read it. And then we take this silence as an overwhelming yes. So we just up and show up in China, and we decide that we're going to do this. Now, when this happens, they're not too thrilled, but all of a sudden it seems like maybe it's not a terrible idea that we are involved in China. And that's going to be because of the Boxer Rebellion. Now, there was a group of people in China who obviously didn't like all this foreign invasion and all these different countries coming in, carving up their country, taking over raw materials and running the show. So they are going to have a severe anti-foreigner sentiment going on, and that's really underlined by what we call the Boxers, and their full name is the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. So these guys are going to really push back on the presence of missionaries, on any Christians who are even Chinese. And what you have is lots of riots are going to happen, lots of fighting is going to happen. And what we know to be the Boxer Rebellion is going to break out in June of 1900. And I know you know this from last year when they lay siege to Beijing and all of this happens. all these European troops pour in, because this is their scenario that they're not going to put up with, right? You have all their good foreign trade going on, all their spheres of influence. They are not going to let this mess with that. And again, they have the military strength because they have the Navy. And we're going to talk about that in class, this concept of jingoism. If you have a really strong Navy, Alfred Thayer Mahan is going to say this, then you have, all the tools you need for imperialism. 20,000 troops are going to pour in, including 2,000 American troops. And all of a sudden, not so bad that America is in China. So by 1901, China has to sign an agreement, and basically they're forced to. And we're going to talk about it, very reminiscent of what happens in Hawaii, as far as just being forced to because you don't have that naval and military strength to push these powers out, and they're already so embedded, and they're already taking over. So after the Boxer Rebellion, of course, the open door policy is strengthened. The Western nations realize they're better united against possible insurgency from the likes of Chinese people. And people are going to unfortunately work together to exploit places like China, countries like Great Britain, like France, like Russia, like us, etc., rather than compete to control China. That's the message of the Boxer Rebellion for the Western powers. Japan. Let's talk about Japan. I told you before that we had a role in Japan becoming so imperialist. So Japan also was completely cut off from foreign trade, from foreign influence. They wanted to be, isolated. We bust in and end that in 1853. So we are going to pressure Japan to open up their ports to us. And Matthew Perry, who knew he wasn't in Friends at this point and who knew he was this old, Commodore Matthew Perry is going to show up in back then what was called Edo Bay, and that's of course Tokyo Bay. When he does, he shows up with these massive steel steamships, right? Massive. Our Navy is huge, and Japan has never seen the likes of this, and they realize that they cannot compete with this because in their isolation, and this is not a judgment or a statement on them as a society or a culture, but in their isolation, while they had been doing all these other things and all these other developments and progressions culturally and technology and everything else, they had not been doing this. They had not been creating these huge steel ships. They had not been working on their Navy like we had and like these other European countries had. So they are both in awe and in intimidation, and realizing too that if they don't want this foreign trade, they can't really force us out with a fight because our ships would dominate and they would win. So they have no choice but to open up for trade. So in 1854, they are going to sign a treaty that says they are trading with us. Japan has this moment, and Japan sees what happened when they were unprepared, and they snap into action, and they are going to modernize like crazy. So we have a little bit of a Frankenstein on our hands. Because we show up, we then create kind of an imperialist monster that Japan is going to become. They are going to industrialize like crazy, modernize like crazy. They get extremely nationalistic. And I'm not saying it's a huge departure from before, but as far as that extreme militarization and that kind of stuff, it's going to continue and continue and continue. They take Taiwan, they take Korea, they want Korea, and Manchuria as well. And we're going to see, you can't talk about this and what happens with Japan and then not talk about what happens later come the 1920s, 1930s, them attacking China and eventually becoming a country that is going to ally themselves with Germany for World War II, right, with that same kind of nationalist message. So this is going to be big. And Russia is getting nervous that Japan is so big, and Russia also wants Manchuria and some of these other places. So what you're going to see in 1904 is a Russo-Japanese war. And the Russo-Japanese war is basically these two powers fighting for complete control of Asia. It's huge, and what happens is, who is our arbitrator, who is our neutral third party who does so well with this? You guessed it, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt comes to the rescue, and he is going to say, of all places, I invite you to New Hampshire. Whenever you hear anyone invite you to New Hampshire, just say no thank you, because stuff doesn't happen in New Hampshire. This Treaty of Portsmouth happens in New Hampshire, that's about it. I'm kidding. New Hampshire's lovely. I really like New Hampshire. Oh my goodness, Hanover, it's beautiful. Beautiful skiing, beautiful in the summer. It's a lovely place. It's right by Vermont. What's not to love? My friend Kristen's from New Hampshire. I'm making a joke. But Teddy Roosevelt is given the Nobel Peace Prize for his work with ending the Russo-Japanese War. But even though he ended it, and even though he was the arbitrator, Japan was clearly the victor here. Japan was clearly number one. Russia would not have won. And we're going to continue to see Japan rival the United States for power in China, in the islands in the Pacific. And when we look at this hyper-industrialized, nationalized, imperialized country that later on we're going to be fighting in World War II, cannot look at them and say that we didn't have some part in the making of them. And it goes back to Matthew Perry. He just should have stayed on Friends. One more thing. We want to show these other countries, and especially Japan, that we have this great Navy, don't mess with us, right? We want the message out there. And how will people know if you have an amazing Navy? Well, they won't unless you show them. So Teddy Roosevelt basically organizes this showboat tour of our Navy to go around the world, and that's called the Great White Fleet. And the Great White Fleet stops us in 20 different ports around the world in 1907, including Japan. And we do that actually for 2 years. And the whole point is, look at us. Look at us, right? That's the whole point. We want people to be intimidated. We want to show that we're flexing our naval muscles. Get it? We'll talk about that in class. And this goes hand in hand with something we're going to also talk about in class, Teddy Roosevelt's method that he employed quite often, and especially with imperialism. Gotta love him as a progressive president in our nation, saving the environment, doing all the things he does, getting the cocaine out of our cough syrup and the rats out of our meat. But as an imperialist, I am so conflicted. I do not love him. And he has this slogan, and he calls it "Speak softly and carry a big stick," meaning if you have the force and the power and the strength, you're not going to need to shout that you have it. People will just see that you have it. And then you probably won't have to use it because people will be intimidated by your power that is visible. You're not waving it around in people's faces. You don't need to do that. It's just understood. Speak softly and carry a big stick. So we're going to talk about that philosophy in class some more. And again, he wanted people to see our really impressive ships to make sure, hey, I'm never going to test them. Look at how big their fleet is. Look at how powerful. Look at all their guns. Look at all their cannons. Look at their steel technology. No way. I'm not going to go there. And that was, again, his speak softly and carry a big stick philosophy. And that is definitely the Great White Fleet and a lot of other things that we do in imperialism. So I'm going to stop there. Quick little intro to imperialism, actually like a quick little middle part of it. And as I said, we're going to start in it in class tomorrow, and that is going to be the Friday before break. And then we're going to talk about it a little bit more after. And it unfortunately perfectly dovetails into World War I because you don't have all these countries competing for all these foreign entities and have peace. Certainly not. It's not how it's going to go down. And then will the war to end all wars? Spoiler, doesn't end all wars, does it? All right, bye guys.